So I think we can start. Hello and welcome to the third of 3 workshops in the Ways of Repair, Loss and Damage public program. My name is Phoebe Lynn Elman, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Ways of Repair. And I'll be moderating today's discussion, Repair and Reparation in the context of loss and damage from climate change, a primer for artists. Thank you all so much for joining us today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Ways of Repair, Loss and Damage is an online artistic research residency, a series of public events, and a set of commissioned critical texts, all aimed at facilitating a transdisciplinary exchange around the issue of loss and damage caused by the climate crisis. The program is part of the Loss and Damage Collaborations Art and Culture program and is supported by the Open Society Foundation. So in November last year, we launched a global call out for the Artists in Residence program, a year-long research opportunity that supports artists' research time to develop a new body of work or a new line of inquiry relating to the issue of loss and damage. We received over 740 applications, and we were very pleased to have welcomed Gabriela Gimatos, Nombuso Matibela, and Sibunelo Gumede, and Zara Malkani as artists in residence to the program. You can find out more about their research proposals on our website under the research section, residency section, and we'll very soon be able to discover the fruits of their labor through a digital restitution of their research on our website. In March, we announced the following critical thinkers who are developing texts of repair: Alexis Pauline Gums, Dr. Farhana Sultana, and TJ Demos. The commissioned texts of repair are intended to provide conceptual frameworks and critical links between the loss and damage discourse and the themes already being widely explored within the loss and damage, the arts and humanities in response to the combined climate, human rights, and environmental crisis, and the drive towards decolonization. To find the bios of each of the critical thinkers and a summary of their proposals, head to the Texts of Repair tab on our website. And today, with our very esteemed speakers, Isatis M. Cintron-Rodriguez, Olúfẹ Táíwò, and Ashish Ghadiali, we will explore the limitations that stop loss and damage policy under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from being able to deliver reparations, why we need to consider reparations as a global future-oriented project that will address the climate crisis, and the role that artists and critical thinkers and remedy. So I'll just briefly introduce the speakers and allow them to say a few words before letting them launch into their keynote presentations. Isatis M. Cintron-Rodriguez is a climate scientist and climate activist at Columbia University in the US and the director of the Ace Action for Climate Empowerment Observatory. Do you want to say hi, Isatis?
Hi, everyone. I'm Isatis from Puerto Rico.
We have Femi Táíwò, who is a philosopher and associate professor of philosophy at Georgetown University in the US. He's the author of Elite Capture and Reconsidering Reparations.
Hey, everybody.
And last but not least, Ashish Ghadiali, founder and director of Radical Ecology, co-chair of the Black Atlantic Innovation Network at the Sarah Parker Remond Center at the University College London, and co-principal investigator of Addressing the New Denialism at the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter in the UK.
Hi, really nice to be here. Great to be here with Isatis and Femi, and you, Phoebe. Thanks.
Thank you. We're very, very grateful to have all of you with us today. Just before we start, I'll introduce some house rules. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be hosted on the Ways of Repair website. The attendees are encouraged to introduce themselves in the chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from, share your thoughts on today's topics, but please note that you will be ejected from the webinar for any abusive comments. And in case you were wondering if there was a glitch, this floating head situation is kind of our signature by now. So you'll just see us, the speakers, at the same time as the background. And on the screen, you'll see the speakers' presentations and the slideshow of images that some of which are just intended to stir conversation or not necessarily illustrate what is being talked about. The slides will be shared with the recording of the webinar, so you can read the captions and find out more about them. And we welcome questions from the floor. But in order to ask questions, please post them in the Q&A box rather than the chat. It's easier for us to find. And where it's possible, we'll try and integrate them directly into the conversation as we go along. And your question can be updated. So don't hesitate to start typing if anything comes to mind while the speakers are speaking. And without further delay, I will now give the floor to Isatis.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm super excited to be here and talk about loss and damage and reparations and where we're with that in the UNFCCC context and outside. So here I had kind of like loss and damage as a definition, and I think that we cannot talk about loss and damage without talking about injustice. And I know that you guys have been immersed in these conversations for quite a few months. So I just wanted to highlight, like that loss and damage recognizes that the impacts of climate change are beyond the capacities of adaptation and require separate like attention and funding. And those like include both economic harms and non-economic loss and damage. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. And this has been a 30-year fight, right? We see here a timeline since the first time that Vanuatu proposed a financial mechanism to address sea level rise. And we got in COP19, next slide, that the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, next slide, was established and was established to promote the implementation of the approach to address loss and damage with associated with the adverse effects of climate change. So on this mechanism, it was like the idea was that it was comprehensive and integrated in a coherent manner. And three objectives: one, to enhance understanding; second, to strengthen coordination and coherence; and third, to enhance support to address climate change. This was kind of stopped or maybe made complicated by the fact that rich countries didn't want to contribute funding or discuss that. So the WIM is directed by the executive committee. Which is the EXCOM. And then as well, we have under the UNFCCC, the Santiago Network, which is about supporting countries to understand their needs, to meet their requests, to receive finance and technical assistance, and can help with understanding where finance needs to flow effectively. And then finally, we have the Loss and Damage Fund that was established in COP27, but still like a lot of the operation and different like methodologies of governance, etc., are being discussed, through the board. So this is what we have under the UNFCCC. Next slide. So what are the limitations under this system, right? Like, first of all, accountability, I don't know her. None of the rich countries want to talk about accountability, and in fact has made it a point to, in every kind of negotiation, to try to sway away of any language or appearance that there is any kind of liability and compensation connected to this. And that was part of the negotiation that led to Loss and Damage Fund. Until this day, we see that being echoed in the board meetings. But the fact that, so basically under the UNFCCC, there is no regime for liability. But the fact that there is none doesn't mean that the countries, as they would like to, can rewrite international law. So in international law, the rights, the human rights that are violated have a right to remedy, including full reparation for climate harms. Next slide. So what does it mean to, next slide. Yeah, so what does it mean for us to guarantee the right to remedy? So first of all, people need to have access to justice, and then different ways to redress the harm. So we need to provide like substantive like restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfactions, and guarantees for non-repetition. Next slide. Okay, so what do we need to consider for all of these is, well, we want to understand like how we got here. It's very important that we recognize the historical responsibilities as well as the delay in climate actions that has fueled this cycle that we have, like more loss and damages and people that are suffering, right? Like, I think that it's very important that we center our people, as well as like the colonial histories that have left nations more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change due to the economic and structural inequalities, as well as that still today, right? Like we have those same structures of colonialism. We have still like resource extraction that is like in the global south, and continues to exacerbate the environmental degradation and and therefore the capacity of some of these communities to be able to adapt to climate change, and the sovereignty that they might have to employ and decide for themselves. We have marginalized groups that have been silenced or have been removed from positions of power and not have much access to decision making, etc. You know, like indigenous people, Afro-descendants, rural communities, and island nations continue to face disproportionate impacts from climate change. But yet we don't often hear from them other than you know, accessory like conversations and not really embedded into power. And in that note too, like recognize the leadership and stewardship that these groups are putting forth for years now, decades, in leading climate solutions and as well harmonic relationship with the environment. Next slide. So what are like reparations framework elements? We are putting together a climate reparations framework. And this is some of the things that we have heard so far. They're not comprehensive, right? Like we have heard like that acknowledgement and formal apology from rich nations, developed nations that have historical responsibility, linked to like education systems where it is embedded through where education system changes, where it's embedded through the society, that recognition of the harm that has been done. We have heard as well the importance of power shift. So recognizing that there are like different communities that has been disenfranchised. How do we ensure that they are in like the decision making? We have also heard about that this needs to be responsive to the harm individuals and communities. And some of those, you know, like our proposals that are out there, for example, the land right restitution with the land back movement in some countries, for example, in the US and others. Of course, mandatory financial contributions that are linked to emissions and like climate inaction. debt cancellation, just transition, and overall like a change of system, right? Like, so this is to say that there are many ways to repair, and what is important is that no external factor defines the correct way to repair for a specific harm, and that this has to be done in community in which the persons that are harmed are at the center and are leading how and what that looks like, right? Like what is possible for this like kind of discussion of climate reparations framework. We started with the CARICOM 10-step program. And in the CARICOM 10-step program, which is for slavery, there are, of course, 10 steps. And some of them include, like, for example, an apology. There are other programs, for example, of preservation of cultural histories and preservation and restoration of those. There is also support to go back to the context and the places where people might feel that they need to. And again, like, there are many ways to repair. I want to if you go to next slide, I want to kind of highlight, and I think that we don't have the video here, but for example, in the Lahaina fire survivors, right, in Hawaii, we have seen that some communities have been processing grief through like equine horse-assisted therapy. And this is profound, right? Because those are some of the things where we are often embedded into this system where, we're talking about financials, and finance is important, but there's no amount of dollars that will repair the harm that has been done. So this will need to be a multi-pronged approach. And we see like how processing trauma is important in this matter. And I would say, given like where we are, and I'm gonna end with this, is that for example, in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, there were many like efforts. And of course, like we know, like community only saves community. And like, that's why it's important to, invest in these systems. But also we had some art forms that were used right after the hurricane to try to help people cope and deal with the trauma and the difficult situations. We had something that's called like art therapy, like that's the name of the organization, and they had a different like workshops with children, right? Like, and it has been shown that art forms sometimes don't require verbal recollection. It can be a drawing or painting and can make like the invisible visible and might be essential to their recovery process. And other like expressions like art can also serve for managing traumatic stress. And then we had like also like a teatro rodantes, it's like a theater on wheels. That was called Ay Maria, right? Like that's like an expression that we would use with the hurricane. And this group didn't have, in the beginning, they were like, we are not finding anything funny to give to people, but kind of find a way, and found themselves like going through schools, through like different through different communities and like performing in public spaces. And like what people said, like, oh, thank you for this love, I really needed it. And I think like that part of the recovery process that has to do with the emotions is not really talked enough in like this spaces. So I really wanted to bring that into like the space of how reparations have different kind of avenues. So I'm very thankful for you to be listening to me today. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Isatis, for your presentation. I think we'll just head straight on to Femi's presentation now, and take it away.
All right. Thanks, Phoebe. Thanks, Teo, and everybody for coming. I have been I've had a few questions put to me, so I thought for my presentation, I would just answer them, and maybe we can go from there to a larger discussion. But they're really deep, thoughtful questions, so I'm appreciative for that. So one question that it was proposed that I answer is, why is it that we need to reconsider reparations and root them in a hopeful future that tackles the issue of climate change head on with distributive justice at its core? So that's a view that I've defended. It's not the way everybody thinks about climate justice. It's not the way everybody thinks about reparations. So why this particular view of reparations as a future-oriented project that's engaged in building a better social order? And I thought I would start off by just contrasting that to that view of reparations I have to loss and damage, which is an important thing that has been won at the multinational stage of politics, and certainly has an important role to play in a broader vision of reparatory justice. But I think some people might confuse for being the whole story of reparations. And as we just heard from Isatis, that's a very narrow view of what reparations should accomplish. So loss and damage, as we just heard, is this vehicle that now exists for sort of reactive compensation. So whatever climate change impacts cause levels of damage and destruction, those should be responded to by financial compensation, by financial help from richer countries to poorer countries, the basic idea. And partly because it's reactive, but also partly because it's responding to climate change impacts, sea level rise, hurricanes, cyclones. I think it involves a narrower view of why we should be giving money, research, technical support, and moving those goods from richer countries to poorer countries than I have. As I've defended, I think of the current economic situation and the current geopolitical hierarchy between nations as being a result of this peculiar thing that's happened in the last few centuries, which is a planet-sized economic and political system. Throughout history, there have been very large trade networks. There have been very large political networks, but the scale of coordinated human activity that we have achieved now is actually something quite new in human history. Most economic historians link it to the 16th century, or say that the construction of a planetary economic order was complete by the 16th century. So it's only been a handful of centuries that we've had that order. And if we look at how that order was constructed, we're just telling the history of transatlantic slavery and colonialism. Those are, in my view, the building blocks of the world, and they don't explain everything about our current system, but they certainly built the current system that has evolved into what we have now. So that system produced the Industrial Revolution. It produced the climate crisis. And it also produced the hierarchy between nations that makes different kinds of nations, different kinds of people and populations differentially vulnerable to climate crisis and climate impacts. It is part of what explains why the Netherlands can have the resources and power to engineer different ways of responding to sea level rise than are currently being tried out in the Caribbean, to just give an example. So loss and damage as a framework to respond to climate change impacts doesn't necessarily in and of itself respond to that larger history. It's part of the response, maybe it's fairer to say, but it's not the whole of the response. The last thing that I want to say on this point is just to call our attention back to the last point that Isatis made, which is that even if we supposed, against the advice I was just giving, even if we supposed that the entirety of climate change impacts or the entirety of the climate justice question could fairly and accurately be confined to what hurricanes strike tomorrow or what the sea level is tomorrow, even if we focused on the climate story rather than this broader historical political story, we would have to confront the fact that not all of the damages that we are headed for are compensatable, right? It's not possible to bring back loved ones we've lost. It may not be possible to bring back infrastructure in cities that are destroyed. It may not be possible, at least on human relevant timescales, to restore ecological damage that may be wrought as climate impacts accelerate. So I think whether we're looking from a narrow climate-focused view or whether we're looking from a broader social historical view, we're pushed into something like the view that I've defended, which is the constructive view, the idea that how we should be thinking about responding to the history of injustice and to the problems of climate crisis should be oriented around building a new world order rather than just responding to the failures of the current one. So I want to answer a second question that I was asked. How can reparations that seek to address the climate crisis work? What examples can you suggest that help us to visualize the future that they could bring? So I want to talk about two examples under this heading, one sort of large and one sort of small, to just get at the size, scale, and vision of the kind of thing that I have in mind, and the kind of thing, much more importantly, that many generations of activists and thinkers and political actors have had in mind when they spoke about reparations and when they spoke about the project of constructing a new world. We already live, in some sense, in the aftermath of an attempt, partially successful, to reconstruct the political order. And that is the wave of decolonization movements that spanned the globe over the middle and end of the 20th century. Before that, the British Empire alone controlled a segment of the human population and a segment of the world's land mass that corresponds to about a quarter of both, quarter of the people on Earth, quarter of the land mass of the world in the early 20th century, just to give you a sense of the scale of what we all know about colonialism and colonial domination. There were many independence movements. Much of Asia and Africa became politically independent in this period. And they didn't just become independent from their respective empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Portuguese Empire, though that is, of course, a very important aspect of the national independence liberation movements that proliferated in this period. But one of the things that the leaders within these movements were discussing and trying to build was a new international economic order. In fact, there was a slate of proposals that went by exactly that name, the new international economic order. We are at the 50th anniversary of that slate of proposals. That's been something that's been represented and celebrated quite recently. And the idea behind the new international economic order was to literally, on a planetary scale, reassess, reconstruct how trade is managed. What is the going relationship between people in, say, Cuba and people in Norway? Is it one of market competition? Is it one of state competition? Or is it one of solidarity? If it's going to be the latter form, then maybe we need ways of coordinating who's going to produce what and who's going to trade what for what, and how we protect so-called intellectual property, or perhaps whether we protect so-called intellectual property. All these global aspects of economic production and political machinations that we have to agree on to some extent and coordinate on to some extent. There's an effort by the newly independent states to try to refashion the political answers to those questions that had been fashioned by the colonial empires of old. Of course, that effort failed at its time, but that effort has been renewed now by Progressive International and many of its member states. So we could ask, literally on a planetary scale, what do we want the rules of the game to be? What do we want the rules of how we live on the planet together to be? And we could take that not to be a settled question by the colonial past that has produced the multinational institutions that we have now, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, and all the balance of power between the actors in these organizations. But we could start anew and try to figure out how to answer those questions. If we wanted to do something short of that, but that would nevertheless work in a constructive direction, then we could move in a more practical direction that was outlined by Isatis just now. Debt cancellation would give the existing states, as imperfect as they are, more fiscal flexibility, especially in the global south, to decide their own priorities with respect to climate and everything else. And it would in and of itself represent a balance of power shift in the direction of more autonomy for more populations of people and less control, de facto control, of some governments and some spending priorities by some creditors in richer parts of the world. So I could blabber on and on about the different aspects of the constructive view and this way of thinking about reparations from a philosophical perspective. But I think what's maybe more useful for today's conversation is grounding it in these very real political stakes that various people are outlining, various people have been fighting for, and that there's been a recent victory on with respect to loss and damage. So I'm going to stop there for now, but I'm looking forward to what you all have to say in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Femi, for your presentation. I'll hand it over now to Ashish.
Thanks, Phoebe. What amazing company to be in today. I mean, incredible presentations from Isatis and from Femi, and just looking at all of you guys on the chat, you know, in Madrid and Memphis and Brazil and Indonesia. It's just so powerful, I think, what Ways of Repair have put together here, and I'm very, very honored to be speaking as part of it. I really started to get involved in the sort of discussions around loss and damage and climate finance around sort of 2020 in what was then meant to be the run up to COP26 in Glasgow in the UK, where I was involved in the COP26 civil society coalition and involved in the political strategy side of that. Obviously, that COP26 didn't happen in 2020 because of the COVID pandemic. and was postponed to 2021. And it was kind of an extraordinary thing at the time that you know, in spite of the 30-year history that that Isatis was speaking to, that struggle from the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, situated almost exclusively in the global south. That 30-year struggle had to push for the recognition of loss and damage had not yet manifested. It was kind of it felt almost miraculous the following year in COP27 in Egypt that we kind of achieved that breakthrough, and that the Loss and Damage Fund was created. I guess I'm saying that because I on the one hand I think it's really important to recognize what that struggle has been about. We're kind of living through the era of escalating global warming, of climate breakdown, and the damage that is incurred that is going to be disproportionately felt by people in the global south. That process is going to continue to escalate, and without that struggle for recognition that the loss and damage debate has kind of carried, people, Black and brown people, racialized people around the world will be invisibilized by this process, and so that struggle is really important. But the reason I kind of just point that out is because actually when we the Loss and Damage Fund has been created, but to date no money has been put into it, and again, as Isatis sort of pointed out, that there has been so much resistance from countries in the global north and from the financial institutions to even recognize loss and damage, that it is very unlikely that the fund will be adequately financed, and in a sense, and there's a really good reason for this, because as climate change escalates, as the impacts of global warming continue to rise through the course of the 21st century, which even with rapid mitigation they would still continue to do for another 30 or 40 years. The damages incurred by loss and damage are going to become increasingly difficult for us, again, to use Isatis' phrase, for all the money in the world to address the harms that are being kind of created by climate change. And sort of that kind of understanding and that recognition was really what sort of drove me to sort of step slightly away from the loss and damage debate and actually start thinking about the architectures of climate finance more widely. It's not just the Loss and Damage Fund that has failed to attract the right level of investment that would be appropriate to the loss and damage being incurred by global warming. It's also climate finance as a whole. The scale of investment required to mitigate against carbon emissions has also failed systematically to attract the level of investment needed. That is essentially related to the kind of the way in which we model climate change, the way in which we have historically come to define our understanding of the impacts of global warming at different scales. The diagrams that Táíwò is very kindly flashing up behind us speak to research that I've been involved with over the last couple of years with a climate scientist called Professor Tim Lenton, where we've been trying to understand where the existing models for articulating the dynamics of climate change economics have been failing. Until now, historically, the model that comes out of the economics of William Nordhaus, 2018 Nobel Prize winner, have repeatedly asserted that it would be cheaper to do it would be more expensive to do nothing at all about climate, about global warming, than to attempt to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And as we sort of started to interrogate where that calculation was coming from, what we discovered was that those calculations were based on a model in which GDP is imagined to continue to grow, that the economy of the world economy continues to grow exponentially, and in which climate change plays out as a kind of static variable that has a kind of, you know, has this, the same impact whether, you know, even as global warming occurs. The report that we put together, it was published in Nature Sustainability last year in 2023. It's called Quantifying the Human Cost of Global Warming, and actually starts to express that cost not in terms of dollars and pounds, but in terms of displacement of what is known in ecology as the human climate niche, the area of the Earth's surface in which human society has historically thrived, and the movement as temperatures increase of that area. So the map that we're kind of looking at now of that projection at in a world where carbon emissions continue to escalate at the rate that they are, reveals that you know, potentially half of the human population would be displaced outside of the human climate niche. Clearly, these are that's a dynamic in which very little economic activity is going to be able to continue in the ways that we are accustomed to, and it points to loss and damage effectively on a scale that starts to become pretty difficult to measure and basically impossible to repair. So in a sense, the kind of the case for climate justice in view of where we find ourselves at this kind of moment in human history really requires us to think beyond the possibility of repair on a one-to-one basis, and to start really taking seriously what Femi was describing as that as the planetary view. We have the level of devastation that you're currently looking at behind me is the manifestation of the system that we have continuing to develop on the train that it is on, and we have to we have to start to consider how does that alternative system, how does that other system in which human life and life itself can thrive on Earth. Like Femi, I also repeatedly look back to that moment of the new international order, but also look back to the origins of it. You know, where is the agency of an alternative vision of world making first created? And I think that when we look at those decolonial movements that really started to pick up in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, so that we could see that the emergence of that alternative vision in all its kind of majesty by the 1950s and the 1960s. Actually, we have to really look back, I think, to those kind of movements in civil society, to the emancipation of African Americans from slavery, and the birth of artistic and cultural movements, the Harlem Renaissance, you know, people like Aimé Césaire, and it's in the I think we find that it's in the artistic and imaginative progress that's made by writers and thinkers and artists in the late 19th, early 20th century that the momentum for a different kind of world that actually then starts to play through decades later into international institutions really starts to take root. And it's that I think really is the kind of call for our generation of artists and cultural activists. How do we respond to the crisis in world making that has kind of brought human history to the place where we find ourselves, and really take seriously our role in creating new and just and sustainable worlds. Thanks very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Ashish, for your presentation, for all three of you for your wonderful presentations. We're now going to jump into a sort of discussion. If you could all appear, because it's not me who's going to speak now. I wondered if we have some questions from the chat that maybe I could weave into some questions that we had prepared, but I wondered if maybe you had questions for each other or wanted to respond to each other's presentations also, if there was anything that maybe is a place to start. But if no burning thoughts, I could jump in with a question.
I mean, it's amazing to be amongst a group of people that I agree with.
Okay. So there was a question from, I hope I pronounced this name correctly, Langa Dorji, whether there is a clear definition of loss and damage under the UNFCCC framework, which perhaps Isatis could answer a bit better. But then also, I guess that extends to a question about how this definition could and should be expanded in order to include things that have been mentioned, such as colonial violence, but also, I think, ecocide, that would make that would be more comprehensive in its analysis, and that would ensure a better delivery of reparation that actually addresses the climate crisis in its multiple origins.
Yeah, under the UNFCCC, there is no accepted definition, but the term is normally used to kind of sort of the definition that I presented, which comes from IPCC, right? Again, they mentioned losses and damages, but it's the first time that in the scientific community it has been raised to refer to those impacts that are beyond adaptation. So it's linked to the negative impacts, and it's kind of connected to loss of community and displacement, biodiversity, loss of heritage, whether that is coastal or cultural. So there's no specific definition. I think because it is so broad, that it has been hard to get a definition. Also political interferences there. And while it might not be completely, in my view, necessary to have a definition under the UNFCCC for it to be acted upon, the different implications and the different, I guess, wait, how you say that? The different interpretations does rise some conflicts, right? We are at a moment that under even the loss and damage fund is getting determining what is the scale, what is the value added, where where do we like begin to draw lines on under those gaps? So yeah, no, like the short answer is like there's no accepted definition. When you ask people, right, like in community, people don't talk like that. People don't talk about like loss and damage, right? Like they talk on their terms. They talk about you know, lives lost, you know, they talk about grief, they talk about like so many different things. So of course, like it would be great to have a holistic definition, but I think that often as humans, we want to define everything. So not to say we shouldn't define it, but I think that it's beyond that, and in the way that it goes into the narratives of the communities and those affected. Like they don't need to like a UN definition to know we're losing corals, we're losing our islands, you know. So yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if either Ashish or Femi wanted to add on to expanding that definition, or if not, we could move on to the next question.
So I mean, it might be useful just to talk to reference that the kind of distinction that is starting to be made within that within the UNFCCC between tangible and intangible loss and damage, right? Like, which so you know, I think that in a sense, you know, the whole sort of discussion base of the UNFCCC is caught up in. I mean, essentially, we live in a world order that's built on empire, but is now neoliberal, right? So the kind of the basic terms of loss and damage, where it sort of breaks down, is that you've got you know, countries that are experiencing great damage, you know, year on year as a result of climate collapse. And you know, obviously the kind of big breakthrough at COP27 was very closely related to the devastating impact that Pakistan had experienced, you know, just months before that. There's you know, I think there's a neoliberal desire to say, well, we could do loss and damage on the basis of this one-to-one, right? Like, you know, how much damage did you incur? Like you know, can that be insured? Can, you know, can the compensation be met one-to-one? And the nervousness comes from the reason that then it always breaks down is because it very quickly becomes apparent that like the on the economic basis that the damage that's going to be incurred is going to be, you know, those numbers get too big and suddenly everyone's like freaking out and going, well, actually this doesn't make any sense. I think that's what's really important for us to keep pushing for, right? Like, yes, you're right, it doesn't make any sense, right? And then the whole thing about I said intangible and tangible, but I think the phrase is economic and non-economic, right? Like, but like, so then once you start talking about non-economic damages and like and like the loss to a culture that, you know, so like, you know, you know, a small island state that is in danger of being submerged, you know, like that like the loss is to an entire history, a culture, a way of life, you know, like, and actually starting to bring that discussion in. Again, it all starts to point to a place where like I guess I'm interested in that moment where actually the loss and damage discussion becomes the basis for understanding the impossibility of this whole way of looking at the world.
Yeah, I think it might just be helpful just as an additional point to just maybe add some background around what Isatis and Ashish are saying. There are these buckets for climate conversation, right? Especially at the policy level. These conversations are happening at the United Nations and at COP. right? So you might hear people say climate mitigation, and they tend to mean things we could do to make climate change, to prevent climate change from getting worse, right? So can we lower emissions, right, of carbon? Can we lower methane emissions? And there's a set of things people talk about under that heading, climate mitigation. Then there's, one level of fatalism removed from that, right? So some amount of climate change impacts are going to happen. What can we do to preserve our lives, to preserve our welfare, to preserve our economic health, even with the climate change that's going to happen? And they call those climate adaptation, right? And there's a series of policies that might help for that. Maybe different agricultural techniques, maybe more resilient maybe more resilient electricity grids that can survive hurricanes and such. And under both of those headings, whether it's climate mitigation or climate adaptation, there's the who's going to pay for it conversation, right? Why should we over here in Guyana or Vanuatu or in Niger foot the bill for economic impacts, for mitigating carbon emissions, for making our grid more resilient to hurricanes that you guys are causing over in high emissions countries? And even on those segments, when we're talking about who pays for climate mitigation or climate adaptation, we're dealing with the obfuscations and the foot dragging and the straight up unwillingness to pay that we've been talking about now under the heading of loss and damage, right? Economists calculate how much finance it would take to lower emissions across the world, how much climate adaptation would cost in the global south. And there's lip service, and there's a green climate fund, and there's promises from the rich countries of the world to chip in. But just as Ashish mentioned about loss and damage, very little climate funds have been committed to either of those, right? Orders of magnitude less, pennies on the dollar less than what would be required to actually make a dent in those. So then when we add to the how do we prevent worsening climate impacts and how do we adapt to the climate impacts we can't prevent, there's the question of what do we do about the destruction that we can't adapt to? And that is typically where people put the loss and damage conversation, depending on the institution and depending on their goals. And then we have the same version of what we were just talking about. There's calculations that could be done about different kinds of damage, tangible damage, non-tangible damage, but there's no real commitment financially, even though there's been at least a tacit political commitment to opening up this conversation.
Thank you all. And I realize that we're moving along in time. So that kind of leads on to a sense, there's a sense of somewhat despair, somewhat. And we have a question from Masumi Moran Chetia, who asks, what is your thought on the future of reparations discourse not being reduced to a sense of cash transfer or financial compensations within the aid world that we have seen, for example, with the critical vulnerability paradigm within the humanitarian development discourse in practice, which also perhaps ties in with the question that's a very technical question about the upcoming new collective quantified goal on climate finance, NCQG, that will be discussed at the COP29 that's going to replace the $100 billion goal set to the COP 2015 in 2009, and what role this new goal should play in delivering reparations that address the climate crisis. How should this how can it be delivered in such a way that it wouldn't just mimic financial compensation, and actually address some of the more all the nuances of the non-economic losses?
I can take a stab at that to start us with. I mean, the new quantified goal by definition is the finance component. So I think that you know, there is within that. So basically that means that we are talking about dollars, right? Like, and that should be the case, right? Like, because we need to make sure that rich nations are abiding by the common but differentiated responsibilities. So the new quantified goal will have, you know, it's basically running on different fronts, but one of them is in the quantum. So it's like how much this should be. Some are starting from the ground up. So some are saying, well, we have the 100 billion, how much we can go farther than that. And then some others are coming from needs. And some of those needs are identified in like the nationally determined contributions, which are like each country climate strategy. Then it's a matter of also what qualities, like what characteristics that goal should have. And some of the, and this is like, I mean, everything is very contentious on that conversation, but a lot of contention is like, where is that money coming from? Like, what are the sources? So one of the qualities is like, this has to be public finance, but that is a big discussion, right? Like, because rich nations would like to put a cap onto how much is public finance, and they think the rest will like magically appear by the private sector. So that conversation is very technical and financial, but in those qualities, right? Like, we're talking about like this recognition of the equity, and that equity principle is like the common but differentiated. So when the convention started, it has been agreed that we needed to have or have a recognition of like, well, there are countries that have the capacity and have more responsibility than others, so the money will flow to them. So a lot of this conversation is starting to be like, well, others now have like more emissions, so let's talk to them without them actually stepping up to the plate. It's also about how this money is disbursed. Like, a lot of it is like, okay, public finance, and then also make sure that this doesn't create more debt for communities and where countries are the ones that are holding debt. So like have that in conversation. So this should be like grants based funding, right? Like, so some of that are speaking to some of the things we're talking, but I do think that it's not really the place to talk about reparations exactly, but yes, take and like that lens of climate justice. So another thing that is important within that process is to also talk about who can access the funding, right? Like, so talk about, you know, definitely like countries, but also, you know, in what ways we can support also communities. So yeah, so and all of that, I think that spreads out to the loss and damage fund as well, that we're talking about community access, etc. And that like all includes the complexities of that. We are talking about voluntary contributions here, that we are talking about this erosion that they actually don't want. They want to like circumvent that principle of common but differentiated, that there is no liability. So there are kind of aspects about finance that we can get within the new quantified goal that are kind of connected to some of these aspects that we're talking about reparations. But within that conversation, there is kind of no space to talk about like what specific programming themes exactly like need to happen, other than what is very important is to have 3 pillars under that. Like it's a very big there's a very big move to have loss and damage as a third and very important pillar, because right now it is not like that. Right now we have mitigation and adaptation, and some like countries talking about that loss and damage could be there in some way, but we want it to be kind of like represented and brought to the forefront as the third pillar of climate action, so we can have a sub goal of that. So yeah, that's where we are with that, and in relation to reparations.
Did you
Maybe
want
I'll
to
just
something?
say,
Yeah, okay, go for it.
yeah, just a quick additional thought. Under the existing multinational institutions, there's a lot more that can be done. Debt cancellation is something that came up earlier. Just to give a second example, there's something called special drawing rights, SDRs, right? Which Prime Minister Mia Mottley and others have called for. They're essentially dollars that can be distributed directly to central banks out of the International Monetary Fund. So we're not talking about raising money for climate process for government revenue through regular taxes, right? There's other ways to give governments money. And right now, those are being distributed to countries by their quota in the IMF. So essentially by how much money they give to the IMF. So that means that the richest countries get the most dollars from this institution, which is, I think, the opposite of what you would want in a more progressive, reparative approach to distribution of wealth. You might think that the richest nations need less of theirs, and the poorer nations, especially the ones that are climate vulnerable, should get more of these. But the decisions of institutions like that are likewise controlled by the richer nations. So it's not an accident that although mechanisms exist to address some of the problems that we're talking about, the problem of insufficient climate mitigation or adaptation or loss and damage funds, the lack of fiscal flexibility caused by the heavy indebtedness of global South countries. So long as the institutions that we have to decide what to do about those things favor the richer parts of the world, we are unlikely to get anything that looks like climate justice. So I think to get out of the pure cash transfer mode of thinking about reparations is to get into the institutional design mode, thinking of how we can change the voting methods or procedures or allocation of votes in these kinds of institutions, and what sort of politics would be required to bend political will to make that a possibility. But we have to think about different institutional design for decision-making on the international level, which is why I brought up the new international economic order earlier, but I think it will apply even at a less grand scale.
I think just to add to that, though, I do think we're in a I mean, what the climate crisis, I mean, essentially the new international economic order was dismantled by the neoliberal ascendancy, right? Like it was understood to be a threat to those dominant interests of finance in the global north, and systematically it was kind of taken apart. And what emerged in place of that language of of solidarity economics was something that was the language of what remains the architecture of like the global financial institutions now, which is the belief in trickle down economics, the belief that if we go into all of these countries and systematically dismantle those apparatus of like subsidy and protection, and that actually you create an open marketplace, and that those economies will develop over time, right? Like that was the zeal of that belief system really transformed global institutions through the 1980s, through the 1990s, and there appeared during that period to be on a kind of overall global economic growth that was propelling that forward. We're now at the end times of that story, right? And the climate crisis is what is the ultimate material shift in the narrative of both neoliberalism and in the multi-century narrative of empire, right? Like Europe remade the world in its image, and now that world is burning, and sea levels are rising, and the economic growth that it's believed in is already elusive and will become even ever more so through this century as the impacts of climate collapse become increasingly apparent. And so we are in this moment now where the imagination of empire and the imagination of neoliberalism, it is to be overshadowed, is to be replaced. And so so yes, there's the question of like how do we when we get to those moments where there is a vote, where an institution is created, where there is an assembly, where thinking about that institutional design questions is undoubtedly important, but actually being able to, like, now is a kind of golden moment that to be able to reveal the contradictions of the neoliberal economic order to itself. Now is the moment that we and I think it really comes down. So where the loss and damage argument is important is because it's constantly pointing us to vulnerability, and where the impossibility of the loss and damage finance argument is really important is because it's saying, like, at the moment neoliberalism basically like places a ceiling or a floor above like the most vulnerable countries, and they become uninvestable, so that they become subject to a kind of climate investment trap. They develop the economies that they believe that they can, but they otherize this subterranean level of the global economy. That subterranean level, that space of chronic climate vulnerability is going to escalate year on year, making it harder and harder for neoliberalism to find anywhere to invest, anywhere to develop growth. And so there's a kind of fundamental paradigm shift that we actually it's right there for the taking, which is that actually, rather than seeing vulnerability as the area where we don't want to put resource, where we don't want to be sort of liable to risk, which is how the current institutions think, actually there's the opportunity to really shift that paradigm and say, well, unless we invest into vulnerability, there is no economy, and actually I kind of wonder whether the other side of the loss and damage argument is a kind of is some sort of is a kind of a different vision where actually that investment in infrastructures of care starts to emerge, over the coming decades as infrastructures of care on the front lines of climate vulnerability actually starts to emerge as the as both the kind of the only economic common sense and also the beginning of a new international economic order,
Thank you all for those responses. It sounds like I just had a question. I mean, one of the questions that came up is possibly is quite pertinent given everything that has been said. Cheyenne Phillips asks, how do we build a new world order when current politics rely on current or old world orders? And some of you, I mean, Ashish, you also are a curator and a filmmaker, and you mentioned art therapy, Isatis. I wondered also about if you could maybe reflect a little bit on the role of art or the imaginary, also as individuals, because so far we've been talking on a very large scale, but I know that you're all kind of involved in various ways in community organizing or in academic or artistic practices. How do you see this playing into reparations or repair that we could do on our own level, and how does that relate to a larger what we're sort of calling for or that we hope to see on a more international level, in certainly flawed systems that we also are asking ourselves, how can we also redesign them and when?
I love the question. I think it's the great question. It's the great question, and I think it. And we tend to project that question up large and imagine that it's about global institutions, when actually I guess my conviction is that it's a question that like really lives within us. That old world order and that new world order are all possibilities within us. We all, well, a lot of the people on this call will, I'm sure, be people who are inspired to create the new, and yet we are always complicit in what's come before us, right? And we are all navigating, having to, pay the bills and and participate in in those systems of oppression and extraction and exploitation, and figure out our way within that. So for me, the space of art and the space of community is the place in which, it's the beginning of that process of going beyond myself and actually starting to try to create the world around me that is a world resilient and responsive to that dynamic of change. But I've probably spoken enough. I would like to hear what Isatis has to say.
Sure. That is the question, right? Like, how do we shift the systems, right? Like, I think that there is power in people, and I think that's where we start, right? Like, we don't see the system and then think about, well, like, we're limited by all of this, and yet we are. But I think that our people have the solutions within themselves, and there is something so magical of bringing people together. So for example, bringing people together to reimagine, kind of dream what a new order, a new system might be, and that can be at different levels, right? Like, we have hosted a series of citizen assemblies in Puerto Rico, and I think even people that have seen it from outside have been like, wow, often we don't let people dream about like what this could be, right? Like we need to rethink our systems, or we need to rethink how we interact with each other. But in that kind of process, what people kind of rely back is like, okay, like it's great that we're talking about like that thing over there, but what we want is like tangible change. It's something that I can grasp, right? Like what can I do within my space? And I think the more that we create spaces of transformation at the local level, it can like, you know, create like this kind of network that can really change like different power structures. Of course, I think we talked about like, you know, how do we think about new governance and power structures and that power shift and deconstructing what has been there and what has been doing harm. But I think that overall, like that solidarity shifts things, right? Like that solidarity and ongoing solidarity. And some of those spaces are maintained by cultural traditions, as well as spaces of like ongoing communication. So in I think like how we communicate with each other. Like, for example, in all of our assemblies, we had bomba y plena, which is kind of like our like ancestral like music. And this was like crucial to bring people together, to bring people, you know, like more break the ice and have them really feel part of a community, where every aspect of the colonial status that we have is meant to disconnect us, right? Like, so in bringing people together, I think like that is very important, and like all of like our social interactions are surrounded by art, are surrounded by culture, in a way or another. So I think like the power is within people. The transformation lies in activating those networks, and then putting it into motion through different spaces that are interconnected by many things, including like art and like the ongoing expression of what that is.
I don't have too much to say on this, other than that I think the role of the artist in social change is maybe less about getting people to imagine anything in particular or have a particular vision of what the world is. You know, I think of what a better world order would be. I think it's more to show people, to make the distance between this world and other ones smaller. Right? I think whatever else has been accomplished by neoliberalism, by empire, by the status quo politics is, I think, encouraging a level of fatalism, a sense of inevitability that I think is counter to making the world better. And I think a cool thing about art, in the best of times at least, is you can look out into a fictional world, or you can look out into a painting, you can look out into a feeling or a sentiment, some otherworldly possibility, and think that maybe we could get there, or at least have that fear feel nearer by than if you just go to work and watch the news and hope for the best but expect the worst. So that's what I would say I think about art in this context.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your responses. We are now at the close or at the end of our session. There's a lot more to say, but unfortunately we have to stop now. So I'd just like to thank all of you for your invaluable contributions, and to our attendees for your active participation. Thank you to the residents for their engagement, to the Open Society Foundation, and to the Loss and Damage Collaboration for their generous support in making this workshop possible. To stay informed about our future events and updates, we encourage you to sign up for the Ways of Repair mailing list. And we would also like to share a short feedback questionnaire. Would be very grateful if you could takes a little bit of time to just give us any suggestions that would help us improve future events. And the recording of this workshop, as well as the reading list, we could compile one, and slides will be shared via email and on the Ways of Repair website in the coming days. So thank you very much again, and I hope to see you at the online symposium in January, which will see individual presentations by the artists in residence and the critical thinkers, followed by sessions that will have them in conversation with each other and other loss and damage experts. Thank you all. Bye.